I'm Libby Hill and I have been a speech and language therapist for 37 years this year. So you can imagine that a lot has changed in that time. And when I look at some of the things that I said and I did, and the approaches that I said we had to do in that time, I'm ashamed. But I didn't know what I didn't know. And I think that's what us as professionals need to do. We need to be continually learning and moving with what we know. So every time we learn something new, we reflect on it. How can we put that into our practice? How can we be better? And I'm really lucky with the team I've got because everybody has that ethos. So it's very easy to do. But I really like this quote because it does make me feel better. Because I was doing the best that I could with the knowledge that I had available at that time. So I shouldn't beat myself up about it. I should just acknowledge it and move on. So I'm going to talk about two children, with their permission, to show you how I've used the accept approach in my approach with them. So Aaron's been through the four foundations, and as Natasha pointed out, it isn't actually rocket science, is it? If we think about how we want to be treated and treating other people how we would like to be treated, well, it's the same sort of logic, isn't it? Surely. So, going to tell you about Sarah. So, Sarah had been at home with her mum full time. She hadn't gone to nursery. She was having a lovely life. And then age 3, her parents split up and her mum had to go back to work full time. So Sarah was put into nursery. She didn't react well to that. She's a very sensitive little girl. Too many people, too much going on. She hated it. So from the age of 3, when she started at nursery, she did not speak to anybody in any educational setting. She was the noisiest person at home, as you can imagine, but not any educational setting. There's a typo there. She was in a primary school. But originally it was a very, very busy primary school. Margaret's visited there. They've got 600 children. So not ideal for somebody like Sarah. I'd met her to do her EHCP report, and I'd felt that, you know, she had so many challenges. She wasn't diagnosed as autistic. She possibly was, but it wasn't diagnosed. But she needed more, I felt, than a mainstream school could cater for. So we'd managed to get her into a specialist, small, independent, but mainstream. So she still could do, she was very bright, she could still do the academic subjects to her level, but it was much more protective. The problem was they had speech and language therapy on site, and they had gone to try a sliding in technique, which is a pretty much go-to technique when you're first starting out to work with children with selective mutism. But it had all gone pear-shaped. So basically, she had actually become so anxious, she wasn't able to attend this school, which otherwise would have been absolutely fantastic. So that's when I was called back in, which is never nice because something has failed, but also to go to a fellow professional and say, well, you know, let's see what needs to be done differently. It's quite hard keeping that person's ego intact, which I want to, obviously. So, the first thing we looked at was the remove step. So we looked at what was identifying the problem. So selective mutism is the symptom of overwhelm. So you know how you would go to fight, flight, freeze? There isn't one for. She was freezing, basically. So we needed to look, well, what is it that's causing her to freeze? Let's not just go to the symptom and see what we can do to fix that, because that's only going to be short term anyway, isn't it? It's not going to, even if you manage to get her to speak to the teacher in class, you're not sorting the problem that's causing the symptom. So it was a big challenge because selective mutism is just the bit of the iceberg that we see. There's so much going on underneath the surface. So there's the predisposing factors. So there was a lady called Lorraine Carmody who looked at, well, why do they develop it? Because all these children cry at birth, they all develop the language and can use it elsewhere. So, what is happening? So she talked about predisposing factors, and a lot of that is about their personality. And there's usually a history of anxiety in the wider family as well. And then there's a perpetuating factors, so the pressure to communicate. And that pressure doesn't just come from external pressure, it comes from their own pressure, which is much harder to work on because we can't do much about that unless we use the accept approach. And the factors will be different for everyone, which is why when you're going to diagnose a child with selective mutism, you've really got to be thorough in your case history and your assessment of that situation, because they will all be very different. We've got the Selective Mutism Resource Manual, but you really need to know how to apply it, not just apply it. So with this little girl, Sarah, she had major sensory issues, so she found it really hard. The new school didn't have a uniform, but she still found it, everything was scratchy and itchy, and some days her socks hurt and some days they didn't. Lots and lots of sensory factors. She'd also got language processing issues, so she had word finding problems. So she got reasons to wonder about whether she was going to be able to speak if she did was able to. She'd got auditory processing difficulties. That goes hand in hand with selective mutism, because when a being is so anxious and they're in that sympathetic nervous system state, you can't access the muscles of the face or the head and the neck effectively. So the little, you're hypervigilant, you're looking out for danger. So we're programmed that the mechanism that filters sound is switched off because you've got to be hypervigilant, you've got to be listening. Could be danger around the corner. So 75% of children in one study who had selective mutism also had auditory processing difficulties. Obviously, she'd got anxiety, then it was like a huge vicious circle. That circle of negativity that Aaron talked about, this was her to a T. Pressures from others, pressure from herself, and she was also a perfectionist. So she had a fear of failure. You know, the ones that do the terribly tiny little writing? That was her. She didn't want to disappoint people. She felt that she was a disappointment to her mum because she couldn't talk in school. So we removed the pressure. It's not your fault. It's not your fault you're struggling with an issue. Your selective mutism is because the environment isn't right. And it's like, is it? Yes, it's not you, it's the environment. And the thing about children with selective mutism is they don't know anybody else necessarily with selective mutism. So when I say, I actually know a lot of children who have selective mutism, some of them look at me as if to say, you liar, because they don't. Now, in actual fact, in a school as big as her first primary school that had 600 children, there were probably several in there. But let's face it, if somebody's just quiet in your class, you're not going to flag that up, because actually it'd be really nice to have 30 silent children in class, because then the teachers could get on with the huge mandate that they have. So I showed her, there's a really nice little book, it's only about £10. I showed her that. It's called Can I Tell You About Selective Mutism by Maggie Johnson. And I put her in touch with some of the SMIRA groups so she could just watch and lurk and see, yeah, actually, it isn't just me. And obviously reassuring her, it's going to be okay. We'll find a way through. Let's face it, after COVID, there are fewer expectations to talk. I used to say, well, maybe you'd like to be able to ask for your McDonald's. Well, when was the last time we ordered a McDonald's verbally? You use the app or you use the console in the store. And spoken communication is only one way. We must be much more eclectic about accepting different forms of communication. If they were in a wheelchair and couldn't walk, we wouldn't insist on them walking, would we? So it's about meeting them where they are, not where we want them to be. And also discussing with the child or the young person about selective mutism, because it's become like the elephant in the room. Everybody knows about it, they've heard everybody talking about it, but nobody has actually sat down and talked about it with that person. So we had some really good conversations about that. And as we were saying, it's the environment. We had to get the environment right. So we did some staff training on low demand communication. There's lots of things that they could do. And she felt it would be really useful to draw up a quick guide. So this was some of the things on her quick guide. I'll do that in a minute. So reaffirming. We do what you need to do at your pace, your way. We stop when you want to stop, and we do as small steps as you need. So I wasn't going to do the sliding in, but there were certain things that she wanted to be better at, and situations where she wanted to be able to communicate rather than speak. So this was her quick guide. She wanted people to recognise that it was actually an anxiety disorder. She felt that people thought there was a choice in it. And you know, I said about you can't use the muscles of the head and neck properly. Well, what that means is you end up with a bit of this. So if the teacher's saying, right, tell me about this, and you're going, the teacher thinks you're smirking and then gets cross. And then, of course, you then become far more anxious and far more withdrawn. And the whole situation is just awful because you're not understanding each other. Remember, it's a genuine difficulty. Have patience. Let her communicate when she's ready. Don't make eye contact, because there's nothing worse than you're trying to process your thoughts or do something for any of us and somebody's staring into your eyes. Don't ask direct questions. Provide her with a means of sharing good news. I mean, we're in a world of technology. There are so many different ways of doing it. I wanted her to be able to have a rapport. She could do emails. Now, some with selective mutism can't do emails, they can't do text, but she was really good with both. But also accept whatever she could give you at the time if she needed to. You okay? She could do with this. And being aware of a slightly slower processing speed when she's anxious. She didn't have a problem with her understanding, but let's face it, when we're anxious, we all can't take in language as we would ordinarily. And many, many people prefer asynchronous communication. So I had an argument with somebody on Monday because it's an interview situation. And I said, could the person have the questions beforehand? And they said no. And I said, but if you give them on the day, they're going to be at a disadvantage because they can't think as quickly. Their answers will be their answers. Nobody else is going to do them, but please can we have them? And this person really had to be persuaded that most neurodivergent people would actually like the answers before, the questions before, so they could formulate the answer in their own time. And the other thing is, they have to think about praise. So you have to be very careful about that. Most of us who work with children are actually a bit over the top with our praise. Wow, that was amazing. If you did that with her, she'd be like, oh. Well, I thought that went really okay. That's what I have to do with her. And don't draw attention to her if she's done something really well. We used to do a lot of adult and community learning work. And so they were families who we were just looking at all sorts of things. So it was a course, and many of the parents had autistic children, but it wasn't your typical course. But I knew that if I'd said to them, do you know, that was a really good idea, they'd be like, I'm not sharing the next one. So I just put it on a Post-it note and then just put it on their desk as I walked past. So they knew it was a really good point, but I wasn't drawing attention. And so it's quite easy to do, you just got to think about it. And there were things that she did want to work on. So, I showed her this. So it was like this big mountain. But if you do small steps, any mountain's possible really, isn't it? So that was how we used the accept approach with her. It's not your fault. I'm with you all the way. And getting the environment right, that's really what we can do. Now, that's not the approach that many people take, but it works particularly with, I'm going to say she hadn't got a diagnosis, but it works particularly with neurodivergent children. Aaron and I have got a mutual case. She came to me 2 years ago and I said, okay, staff training and getting the environment right. And she said, okay, and when are you going to get her to talk? I said, I'm not. She said, no, you need to put that in the HCP because she's going to need to talk. And I went, no, I'm going to put that she needs to have a regular and consistent adult. She needs somebody that she can build a rapport with, trust with. She's showing us she doesn't feel safe. So let's get the environment to enable her to feel safe. Now, this particular person was a fixer and she didn't like what I said. So she went to another speech and language therapist who, she's great, I love her. I do refer people to her, but she worked on brave talking. And we're going to get you to talk. We're going to put you in situations where you don't feel comfortable and we're going to make you do it. Well, of course, I know that wouldn't work. You know that wouldn't work. They've just come back and I know they know it doesn't work. And they are now happy to do the way that I suggested in the first place. And I haven't said I told you so. I have been, but it's a shame because if I gave them Aaron's details at the time, we've wasted 2 years and how much more trauma. And that's what the girl says. She said, I got to I couldn't do the sessions because I was traumatised. That's not what going to speech and language therapy is supposed to be like. We're nice ladies. Well, there are some men as well. But. So that's how I used it with selective mutism. So as I say, she hasn't got a diagnosis, but it's how we could use it in a different way. So then we come on to Alec. I love Alec. So he is autistic. Very, very good concrete understanding of language, very good expressive skills. I would argue they are better than mine. But he's got weaker narrative and verbal reasoning. So again, if you give him time to process, if you give him the right questions, show him exactly what he's got to do and how he's got to do it, he is great. But it's about other people knowing what he needs to support him in that. But he's an emerging social communicator. So I was going to go through what that meant, but I'll whiz through that a minute. So basically, his general cognition is here, and his social cognition is about here. He lives in his own world, really, and yet he has to go to school and be in a neurotypical world, and that's where his real problems are. So lots of friendships breaking down. He felt that he's not fitting in. And this is what's told him all the time. They're not fitting in. Just not fitting in. He was always getting into trouble. And his sense of justice and fairness was causing terrible issues. So, things had happened like somebody threw a ball at him in the playground and the dinner lady had said, oh, don't worry, it was just an accident. So the next time he's throwing a ball, and it hits somebody. And they're saying, right, that's it, you in. And he went, no, hang on a minute, it was an accident. Like last week with me, it was an accident. No, you're in. Well, that's not fair. Ends up arguing with the dinner lady, who calls the class teacher. So he's arguing then with the class teacher, who calls the head teacher. Now, how is that going to be any different? He is still very upset because his sense of justice and right is being violated. So then he gets a suspension, and so this was happening time and time again. So I'm going to skim through this basically, but he'd got a very weak social radar. He wasn't in tune with what was happening around him. Lots of sensory integration issues. He wanted to interact. He wanted to be friends with everybody, but actually he didn't really have a clue how to do that. He knew he was much safer talking to the adults. He did have an unusual tone of voice. He used volume for emphasis. There wasn't much intonation in there. It was just very loud. And he was just very weak at tracking what other people were talking about. So there could be a group of people talking about last night's football match and he'd go and say, guess what I did last night? Although I'm a bit like that. So I'm just going to whiz through that. But basically, he definitely had a weakness reading people's intentions. Now, this is a typical weakness with neurodivergent children, but it's one that makes them very, very vulnerable. So if you don't know whether somebody's intentions are good or whether somebody's intentions are bad, how are you going to be? And if somebody's coming up to you smiling and they seem really, really nice, then you're likely to think they're nice people because that's what you've sort of worked out. But we know that's not necessarily the case. So it just wasn't working for him at school. So the first thing was we removed him. Don't go, let's find a better one. So we found somewhere that did get him, that was quite happy to accept his quirkiness. Because let's face it, they were lucky to have him. I mean, he was a lovely guy and his academic ability was really good. But just like the younger Aaron, he'd thought it was all his fault. Nobody had said to him, it's not your fault. Nobody had ever said that to him. And he actually had no issues communicating with other autistic young people. So I introduced him to the double empathy theory by Damien Milton that most of you will know about. But it's all about, if you don't, how it's a bit like a dog and a cat trying to communicate. They'll have a go, but they're bound to have a few mishaps because they're not actually from the same culture, really. So Damien Milton wrote about this in his Mismatch of Salience book to start with. And he talks about, the neurotypical way of communicating and the neurodivergent way of communicating. So who's the one with the problem? And I'll come back to that in a minute. Something else popped into my head to tell you. So if we measure social competence versus your neurotypicals, we're going to see significant difference. But if we measure against other autistic people, there isn't a problem. And as I say, the problem is when the cat and dog talk, or the neurotypical versus neurodivergent, that's when they both have difficulties. So I was able to show him, it's not just you. It's not, literally, it's not your fault. And so by giving him that and reassuring him, we looked at the differences in communication. He'd been told all the time. And when you're writing an EHCP report, it's really hard because obviously you really have to highlight the difficulties or the weaknesses. But in real life, we shouldn't be doing that. So he'd been told he'd got these difficulties, and I said, it's just differences. And we looked at a problem-solving approach because there were things he did know were an issue and he would like to get better at. And I introduced him to, it's called the Post-14 Personal Development Programme. And it's by two educational psychologists, Abigail Stern and Claire Carroll. And they specialise in autism and selective mutism. And Claire won't mind me telling you that her son is autistic with selective mutism. So she'd taken the Preparation for Adulthood document and made it into a much more user-friendly document programme. And it's free to download. So there's no charge at all. So nobody can say they can't use it because it's free to download. So I showed him that. And with that, there are lots of things they look at it, they decide what they might like to do better with. There'll be some things that they really can't do, but actually, well, I don't want to do that. So they wouldn't include that. So it's all about they're setting the goals, they're setting the targets. And I'm happy to do problem solving with them under those circumstances because it's not me setting them. And there's another one, he'd seen this girl on the bus in the morning, thought she was really nice, but he didn't know how to talk to her. So he said, could we actually have a look at some of those issues around that? So I do recommend this Post-14 Personal Development Programme because it's very flexible, but it's completely under their ownership. So the reaffirm part of it, we're not going to do anything you're not happy with. You're choosing it. You're in charge. I can advocate if someone isn't doing what we discussed. So as I was talking earlier in the week, I tend to be the bad person in many meetings. But hey, that's my job. I promised him absolutely no worksheets because he thought social skills, worksheets. So it's not social skills, not worksheets. And I talked about, you're not going to be wanting me to do that with you. What you need is a mentor. So I can work with a mentor, but you need a mentor, somebody young and cool and that you want to spend time with. And so that's what we put in place. We were in a tribunal on Monday, weren't we? And it was horrible because she'd had 2 speech and language therapy assessments. First one by the NHS therapist, who is a really nice lady, very nice lady, but she said that she needed work on her social skills. But when she said to the girl, right, should we work on your social skills? She went, well, I won't repeat what she said, but she said no. And then I saw her and basically found the same conclusions. But what I said to her was, here, let me show you this by Claire Carol Abigail Stern. You want to go to university. You want to be more independent. Well, how about we look at some of these things? Because at the moment it's really tricky for you. How about we work on some of these things? What do you think? And she went, yeah. So the problem in the tribunal was we got one speech and language therapist saying, can't work on her social skills, won't do it. So the LA obviously aren't listening to me, who is saying she needs a mentor, she needs to be blah, blah, blah. They're saying, no. And how many times did she say? But they said no, so there's no funding. And in the end, the girl actually got so frustrated by it, she came on into the tribunal. And the judge said, can we ask you some questions? And she went, as long as they're not stupid questions. She was brilliant. And she said, yes, I do want speech and language therapy, but it can't be some rando off the street that wants to do social skills with me. So we had to reassure him that he was doing really, really well. And now he is doing really, really well. So his independence has increased a lot. So he wants me to tell you this. So when I said could I talk about him today, he said, these are what he wants you to know. So he feels more independent. He feels freer to choose social situations and friendships. One of the things that we always work on when anybody with any social communication differences is to be able to advocate for themselves. So that being able to say no is so important. And he wants you to know that he has a girlfriend and it is the one from the bus. So we don't work on social skills anymore because we feel it's outdated and it's actually dangerous. So basically, it can be traumatizing if you're forced to make eye contact, but also teaching those social norms just leads to masking. And I know that there are some people who think masking is a good thing, but it isn't. So I'm going to skip through this because you can have the slides. But what we do need to do when we have a girl like the one that we both had for that tribunal on Monday, we have to consider, what are you actually trying to achieve? We have to think critically about the desired outcome or the goal. So it's got to be useful to that young person or those around them, or is it just useful for the people around them? Is the goal more for achieving neurotypical expectations or valuing and authenticating the child's natural behaviour? And that is why I really like the accept approach, because it helps simplify our thinking on that. So if we just remove, remind, reassure and reaffirm, that is the way forwards. So thank you very much for listening.